Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Pranya and I head the Japan desk at the Ananta Aspen Center. The Ananta Aspen Center has had a long and close engagement with Japan. We regularly organize public sessions and closed-door roundtables in addition to the prestigious India-Japan Track 2 Strategic Dialogue and the US-India-Japan Trilateral Track 2 Dialogue. We also convene visits of parliamentary delegations to Japan to develop greater understanding and cooperation between policymakers in both countries. This series on India-Japan partnership perspectives is held with the support of the Nippon Foundation to explore many contours of the essential partnership between our two vibrant democracies. Today, I am truly delighted to welcome Ms. Mihoko Matsubara, Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation, Japan. Ms. Matsubara has previously worked at the Japanese Ministry of Defense and has served on the Japanese government Cybersecurity R&D Policy Committee between 2014 and 2018. Thank you, Ms. Matsubara, for joining us today and taking the time out to address this session. We are delighted to have you. Also glad to have Mr. Govindraj Ethiraj, founder, Boom and IndiaSpend, a Kamalnayan Bajaj fellow, with us today to chair the session. Mr. Ethiraj, as always, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us. We really look forward to what I'm sure will be an interesting and insightful conversation. Over to you, Mr. Ethiraj.
Thank you, Pranya. Little bit of background. Sometimes these things make news. There was an attack on Colonial Pipeline, which supplies fuel or crude in the United States. And that's only because people experience the outages, the energy outages. Half of the East Coast is supplied by Colonial Pipeline of the United States. And therefore, people knew that something had happened. In this case, we were talking about a ransomware attack with a ransom demand. The event or the episode made news once again because the company in question paid the ransom of $4.4 million in Bitcoin. That value has fallen, by the way. And it again made news, bizarrely or amazingly, because the Department of Justice in the United States was actually able to recover some of that ransom from those hackers who brought that pipeline to a halt. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. The company says that it has to spend tens of millions of dollars now to actually restore the systems, and I'm assuming some of it will have to be actually rebuilt. So when attacks happen on organizations, companies, countries, oftentimes you may not even know it's happened. Sometimes you will, like in this case, when it becomes public for many reasons. But the damage is definitely there, and the damage is severe, and it's getting worse. The only distinction, like I said, is in some cases you may just not know about it, but there will be a cost to it for someone down the line. At the G7 Wealthy Nations Summit that's in the United Kingdom last week, world leaders actually demanded that Russia take action against those conducting cyber attacks and using ransomware from within borders. So that gives you a sense on how this issue is being perceived and who is being seen as responsible, if nothing else, then perhaps for harboring these ransomware hackers. At the same summit, the Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga of Japan said that internet shutdowns, disinformation, and ransomware attacks threaten democracies at the very fundamental level. And that in some ways highlights the nature of the problem and the challenge that we're facing, that it's much bigger and much affects us at a very, very fundamental conceptual level than just a company whose business is perhaps threatened for a brief period. So on that note, I'm happy now to hand over to Mihiko-san for her presentation, and look forward to a conversation and the questions that I'm sure many of you have for her on this very important issue. Thank you once again to the Ananta Aspen Center for inviting me. It's over to you, Mihoko-san.
Thank you so much for having me. So thank you. So I'd like to talk about the recent trend of cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks, and also how Japan and India can work together to tackle with these grave threats. So first of all, let's take a look at what kind of cyber threats we are facing in the world. So according to the World Bank, in 2019, the global GDP has reached almost 88 trillion US dollars. And the Cybersecurity Ventures, an American cybersecurity consulting firm, predicted that the global cybercrime damages will reach almost 6 trillion US dollars by the end of this year. So what it means that almost 7% of global GDP is taken by global cybercrime, including ransomware attacks. And the global cybercrime damages will go up further to 10.5 trillion US dollars, so over 10% of US global GDP. So this is really devastating. So that is why Prime Minister Suga and President Biden from the United States mentioned that cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks, are the grave threats and concerns to national security. And unfortunately, we are becoming more vulnerable during this pandemic because we are more reliant on IT tools and cloud usage tools during this pandemic. Because now we are under the lockdown and now we are concerned about infections of the COVID-19. So we naturally spend more time online to stay connected with our loved ones and family members and friends and colleagues. But it also pushed up the ratio to click phishing or spear phishing emails. So the ratio to click such links or attachment was less than 5% before the pandemic, but it went up to over 40% to click after the pandemic started. So it is actually, from the perspective of the cyber criminals and state-sponsored actors, that it's a prime time to make money and steal intellectual property during this pandemic. And because now we are more reliant on different types of IT tools like Zoom or webinars, so it really expanded the attack surface to cyber criminals and state-sponsored actors. But even though we are now using a totally different IT working environment, we are not necessarily aware of cybersecurity or cyber attack trend. And only 43% of global employees have received remote working specific cybersecurity training, according to NTT findings last year. So that is why the remote workers are not necessarily aware of cyber threats and what kind of behavior they are expected to take during this pandemic. And can you actually believe that only 20% of remote workers never use their work laptop for personal ends like online shopping? And almost 40% of global employees who are working remotely from their home have uploaded their corporate data up to non-work applications. So we are giving away our precious data to cyber criminals and state-sponsored actors. And during this pandemic, because some countries are really devastated in economic status, and unfortunately, some employees are under salary cut or even layoff. So we have increasing cyber threats and also increasing insider threats by disgruntled employees. And because they are working from home, so we have less visibility to by supervisors and the co-workers to see what's going on in the other end. And according to NTT, the three most targeted critical infrastructure sectors during this pandemic are manufacturing, healthcare, and education. And interestingly enough, those three sectors are also the three most less protected in terms of cybersecurity sectors. So they are in a vicious circle because they don't spend enough money on cybersecurity, so they are less prone to cyber attacks. And without doubt that the healthcare sectors is one of the critical infrastructure sectors we are most reliant on during this pandemic. However, the healthcare sector is less protected by cyber attacks because according to various sources, the healthcare sector tends to spend less resources on cybersecurity. For instance, healthcare sector tend to spend only 3 to 4% of cybersecurity budget out of their IT budget. However, the ratio is almost twice or even 3 times or 4 times bigger in the finance. And because they spend less money on cybersecurity, so it means that they have less cyber defenses in the healthcare sectors. Because most of the cyber attacks are coming from phishing emails or spear phishing emails. So email security is crucial. However, 86%, almost 90% of healthcare institutions do not use any email scanning or filtering tools. In that case, how can those staff members in healthcare institutions, including hospitals, can protect themselves from phishing or spear phishing emails? They are so vulnerable to cyber attacks. And the cyber attacks against healthcare sectors and also the cold chain, which is indispensable to deliver COVID-19 vaccines in a safe and secure manner, are targeted by cyber espionage and also ransomware attacks. And cyber espionage go after the COVID-19 research and development information, especially vaccines. Why? Because vaccines are key to recover your economy, key to be more influential in the global economics, and the key to play a diplomatic card in the international community. And both Indian and Japanese healthcare institutions, including academic institutions and pharmaceutical companies, are targeted by state-sponsored cyber espionage to steal vaccine information, because both of the countries that were the producers of vaccines for the COVID-19. And according to CrowdStrike and Cypharma, both of the cyber espionage attempts are from the same country, namely China. And ransomware attacks are devastating, especially these days, because they take business continuity as a hostage. And not only that, ransomware attackers steal precious information, including personal data of employees and partners, and also intellectual property, and threaten a victim to leak stolen data to online unless a ransomware is paid. And Q1 of 2021, already the 77% of ransomware attacks are this type of double extortion type of ransomware attacks. And ransomware attackers are taking advantage of the vulnerabilities during this pandemic, and it went up by 485% increase in 2020. Can you believe this is a huge increase and jump in 2020? And more than that, we already have seen that the number has doubled in Q2 of 2021 compared to the Q2 of 2020. So we will continue to see the more sad news about ransomware attacks, unfortunately, after the JBS and also Colonial Pipeline attacks in the United States. So there are only a few examples of ransomware attacks in the world. And the Colonial Pipeline and the JBS case already have showcased that this type of cyber attacks can disrupt supply chain of fuels and food, which are the indispensable part of our business operations and the daily lives. But maybe you have not seen the news that the ransomware attack already hit police or healthcare institutions in other countries. So for example, the Washington, DC Metropolitan Police was hit by a ransomware attack 2 months ago. And the attacker was able to steal 250 gigabytes of secret information, including informants, policemen's personal information, and secret information given by FBI and Secret Service. So this is a matter of the human lives, because bad guys can take advantage of that information on personal information around informants and the policemen to send blackmail or threaten their lives. And also it can have a negative consequences to future crime investigation. And healthcare services in Ireland and New Zealand were disrupted by a ransomware attack last month. And especially patients of cancer and then had to postpone or they have to take their medical treatment in other districts in each of the countries because the cancer treatments use a massive amount of IT data such as scanners or 3D data of the treatment part of their body. So it means that ransomware attacks can not only a threat to national security and economic security, but it can also threaten our lives. So here's a really sad and unfortunate statistics of ransomware attacks in India and Japan. So these statistics come from Sophos, British cybersecurity company. And according to their data last year, 90% of ransomware attacks against India and Japan are successful. So it is a time for both of the countries to enhance our cyber defense to protect not only from ransomware attacks, but also from other types of cyber attacks. And according to CrowdStrike, an American cybersecurity company, 52% of Japanese companies and 74% of Indian companies are already a victim of a ransomware attack or ransomware attacks between 2019 and 2020. And there are only a few examples of ransomware attacks against Japan and India since 2020. And you can see that there are various types of critical infrastructure sectors are damaged by ransomware attacks, such as gaming, pharmaceutical companies, and manufacturing, and food companies in both of the countries. But fortunately, Japan and India have been really stepping up to enhance our defense and economic partnerships over the course of the years. And in terms of cybersecurity collaboration, have been really deepened and expanded over the last decade. We already have a diplomatic cyber dialogue between the two countries, and we also have Memorandum of Cooperation on cybersecurity, but also the ICT. Because to have a good cyber defense, we not only have to have a good people and process and technology, but we also have to have a good IT infrastructure, transparent and dependable. So that is why the two countries decided to sign the Memorandum of Cooperation, not only on cybersecurity, but on ICT earlier this year. And we are not only not part of the bilateral agreement and the partnership, but also we are part of the bigger multilateral collaboration, such as the Quad Summit has already agreed to have cybersecurity and emerging technologies working group. And after the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games, the Japanese government plans to release a new national cybersecurity strategy. And the Japanese government has already provided the gist of the national cybersecurity strategy last month. And there are a couple of points I found really interesting and which we have never seen before in the previous versions of national cybersecurity strategy in Japan. For example, the national cybersecurity strategy will refer to the importance of free and open Indo-Pacific and the collaboration with other countries, namely Australia, India, of course, and the United States, to protect the free and open Indo-Pacific, because cybersecurity is another part of our national security and also economic security. And resiliency is also mentioned a couple of times in the gist of national security. And for the first time, the Japanese government will mention and define cyber attacks can constitute part of armed attack. And the government has already mentioned this definition in a Ministry of Defense or Self-Defense Forces related documents, but this is for the first time for the government to mention it in the national security. So it means that it is the defense collaboration on cybersecurity can be now part of the national cybersecurity strategy of the government of Japan. So it can also have some influences between the collaboration between Japan and India for the cybersecurity and ICT. And Japan and India have been really struggling with tackling the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year. And I'm very saddened to see the recent hike of the infection ratio in India. But we learned some lessons from the recent spike of cyber attacks and the COVID-19 infection, because there are some similarities between the cyber attacks and the COVID-19 pandemic. Computer virus and the COVID-19 virus are both invisible, but it doesn't mean that they are not there. We still have to keep fighting, and there are actions to take. The basic hygiene, to wear a mask or the installed antivirus software into your IT systems, including your laptops, is indispensable. And early detection is also needed because we cannot protect ourselves 100% from infection. And it is also crucial to contain the expansion of infection as soon as possible, because sometimes we cannot detect and we cannot protect ourselves from infection. To do that, we have to have a national level of crisis management and response, but we also have to have an organizational level of crisis management and response, because it is now a matter of human lives and also not threat to national security and economic security. So it is our responsibility to take actions at individual level, organizational level, national level, and also bilateral level between Japan and India, friendship and partnership. And of course, we have to have a good technology. We have to have a good pharmaceutical companies or antivirus or cybersecurity companies to protect ourselves. But more than that, and more importantly, we have to have each citizens to understand the need of the actions to take. And we have to have a good understanding and cooperation from every single of citizens to tackle with the COVID-19 pandemic and also cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks. So it's been a really challenging year for both of the countries and also for the world, from the COVID-19 pandemic and cyber attacks. But now we are getting more stronger than ever. And we have each other between Japan and India to fight against COVID-19 pandemic and cyber attacks. So there are some steps to take in the future from the Japanese and the Indian end. So information sharing is indispensable, because if we can share the threat intelligence on ransomware attacks or state-sponsored cyber espionage early enough, then we can protect ourselves from similar types of attacks, or at least we can manage and contain the expansion of damages caused by such ransomware attacks. But cybersecurity is not possible only by technology. We also have to have a good and reliable and transparent IT infrastructure, such as 5G or 6G or beyond. So we also have to have a good supply chain risk management in Japan, in India, in the world, and also the bilateral collaboration. And we also have to have a good people, because unless people are interested in this type of issues, how can we protect ourselves if people don't care about pandemic or cyber attacks? So that's why we have to nurture the next generations. We have to have a good business leaders and national leaders to understand and what actions to take for cybersecurity. So talent development by cyber exercises, defense exercises, and the people exchanges will also help the better cyber defense in Japan and India, and also for the two friends. So thank you very much. And I really appreciate your interest in cybersecurity and also the collaboration between Japan and India. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Mihoko-san. So, let me ask you a couple of broad questions. I mean, and you worked in government in the past as well. So how does a collaboration, in this case, between India and Japan? So let's say I'm a company, maybe I have the resources to fight a potential cyber attack, or maybe I don't have the resources. How do I, as an independent or a private institution or a private organization, benefit from this collaboration? Who can I reach out to, and what is the government doing or the government's doing that could potentially benefit me?
So fortunately enough, the Japanese and the Indian government have started the bilateral collaboration. And because both of the countries have national CERT, the technical incident response organizations at the national level. So if we can share the specific cyber threat information in a timely manner between the two countries, then the both of the national CERT in India and Japan can serve as the point of contact to forward that information to the stakeholders in each of the countries, so that we can have a cascading effects to protect ourselves from the cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks.
Right. And what's your sense? I mean, you talked about talent and, people, which of course is at the core of this. I mean, to fight smart hackers, you have to have smart defenders. So, do governments have the best talent, or even if they have, are they able to access the best talent? Can private sector, I mean, I'm talking about private sector for now, and I'll come to espionage in a moment. Can private sector benefit from that?
So it's not one shot effort, it's an ongoing effort, because there's always an evolution of technologies and also the tactics by cyber criminals and state-sponsored actors. So we have to keep learning, and we also have to keep nurturing and investing in next generation pipelines, but also in leadership. Because unless leadership really understands what's going on in the cyberspace and in the world, how can prioritize to allocate limited amount of resources to cybersecurity? Because we have already tons of headaches, not only the pandemics and the cyber attacks, but also the tension between United States and China and else.
Right.
So
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So, you talked about three areas, manufacturing, healthcare, and education being targeted more now. And equally, these are sectors where cyber investment has not been sufficient or as much, maybe as compared to banking. How do I know, so how do, give us an insight into how the cyber hackers work? As in, how do they target? Do they choose industries which are obviously weak, or do they choose industries, for instance, for their propensity or their ability to pay ransom? You can only blackmail someone who has money.
So I think there are a couple of reasons why they go after the manufacturing, healthcare, and education during this pandemic. Because now schools now abruptly adopted remote learning during this pandemic. But schools are not universities or colleges, but usually schools for K-12 schools. They usually do not have focused cybersecurity team to protect themselves. So it's an easy target and a low-hanging fruit from the perspective of cyber criminals to go after. On the healthcare sectors, because they had to have some of their staff members work from home during this pandemic, and they also had to establish PCR test centers and vaccine centers and connect themselves between each other. So they have more IT assets to protect, but they do not necessarily have a budget to cover those new IT assets from cyber attacks. So that's why they are also vulnerable to cyber attacks. In addition to they are already vulnerable, and they have less cybersecurity budget compared to other sectors, including finance and manufacturing. Because in the pandemic, they had to also shift to more digitization and more internet connected devices at factories. So that's why these three sectors are more vulnerable during this pandemic.
Right. And, we talked about the Colonial Pipeline, which is maybe the most recent and the most visible case where ransom was demanded, ransom was paid, and then the Department of Justice or the FBI actually got back some of that money. Now, this is a case where everything has come out. There must be a lot of cases, and you quoted some of examples of Indian companies, including Honda, India, Haldiram, Dr. Reddy's, Navjeevan Cooperative Bank, which have obviously been attacked. So do you have a sense that these were successful from the attacker's point of view, that ransom was paid?
So in most cases, companies do not report or disclose they've been hacked by ransomware attackers. And because they feel so cornered by double extortion type of ransomware attacks, because their business continuity is held as a hostage, or the ransomware attackers threaten them to dump intellectual property data into online. So they sometimes have no choice, but they choose to pay a ransom to take back their business continuity, to at least to make criminals promise that they will not share the secret data. But because they are criminals, there's no proof so that they will not share the data with other criminals.
Right. So what is your advice to companies? If you are hit by a ransomware attack, it may be a small one, it may be a big one, it may threaten your business continuity, or it may just involve leaking some information from within your company. What is your advice to CEOs or CTOs?
So once you notice and then you are hit by a ransomware attack, and make sure to consult with a third-party cybersecurity company which specializes in ransomware security, because they know that now, well, they can at least estimate how much time you will need to recover from cyber attacks. Because unless you know the third-party opinion, then you feel really cornered and pressured to choose to pay for criminals.
But should one, many of these companies are listed on stock markets, exchanges. Should they reveal that they have been attacked, or keep quiet and wait till it escalates a little more?
So it is really a fine line between to choose to report to the regulators or not, because sometimes the guidelines of cybersecurity do not have a clear statement on when and how the company should report that kind of ransomware attack to the regulator. Because usually national regulators require companies to report cyber attack incident when personal information was taken. But if the ransomware attack only encrypts some of your data, or they didn't steal information on personal information, then it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to report that back to the regulators.
And what's your experience from within Japan? I mean, amongst the companies that you've seen who've been affected, how have they responded? Do you think the process that they've followed has been a good process, or are there lessons to learn and lessons that you can share with those who are watching today?
So we've been seeing an increasing number of reported ransomware attacks against Japanese companies, and especially major ones, over the last 6 months or so. And not always, but usually those the subsidiary of Japanese major companies outside Japan have been targeted by a ransomware attack, because usually subsidiaries of companies have less cybersecurity budget on this cyber defense protection from any types of cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks. So that's why then I think that criminals are going after the low-hanging fruit to penetrate into their system.
Right, and I'm going to come to questions, and there are quite a few good ones coming. So, at the G7, there was a strong statement made by the leaders asking Russia to, do something about particularly hackers who are maybe in Russia. So, one is to prepare strong defenses, whether it's an espionage level or at a company level. How do you go after the source? How do you attack this problem at source? And what can either companies or even governments do about that?
So again, it's better to step up your cyber defense now to protect yourself from potential cyber attacks, including ransomware ones. And B, once you are hit by a ransomware attack, it's better to report back to the third-party cybersecurity company to ask for their opinion. And also, it's better to report to the government so that the government can share that kind of information in an anonymous manner so that other companies in your own country can protect themselves from a similar attack. And the attribution is a tricky one, as always. But ransomware attackers usually have their own specific website on the dark web. So it's usually easier for the victims or the cybersecurity companies to identify where or which actors has launched this specific ransomware attack.
Right. Okay. So if we were to come back to, let's say, the India-Japan context, you're saying one is to share information with the government, but how do I prevent myself? Can the government do something about this? Can India and Japan as governments, if both governments know that, let's say, most of the attacks are coming from this place, can the governments do something about it? Would it be sensible to expect governments to do something about this in future?
So, according to Kaspersky, a Russian cybersecurity company, their statistics 5 years ago says that 75% of ransomware viruses are made by Russian-speaking criminals. And FBI Director Ray recently talked to Wall Street Journal that the FBI is investigating 100 types of ransomware attacks, ransomware viruses, and most of them are from Russian-speaking cyber criminals. So it means that most of the ransomware attacks are coming from specific country. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that specific country is cooperative to investigate and make those criminals accountable for their crimes.
Right.
So there are a few options to take. So one is to have a diplomatic conversation in an open or closed manner. Or B is to do sanctions against them. And C is because there are already so many sanctions against specific country. So it is also in parallel, you have to step up and enhance your cyber defense to protect themselves.
Right. Okay, let's take a few questions. So Siddhartha Dasgupta asks, what remedies are available against such wanton cyber attacks? Is there any international law enforcing body to check these incidents? Can anyone complain to any global institution?
So last year, Interpol has released a report that the increasing amount of cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks against healthcare institutions. So not only national law enforcement, but also international ones, including Europol or Interpol, have been going after cyber crimes.
Okay. Anit Mukherjee asks, he thanks you for an excellent presentation and points. Do we have much idea about Japan-India cooperation in cyber defense cooperation against state actors? In other words, is there any discussion about government to government and perhaps MIL to MIL cooperation in this area? What are the prospects and problems?
So both of the countries have had a bilateral cyber dialogue a couple of times over the last decade, but usually they haven't released much information about the contents of their discussions. They only say that the two countries have updated their national strategy, and also they've shared the concerns over the cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. That's all. So I'm not sure that what kind of status and their bilateral cooperation has reached so far. But given the G7 agreement and communique and the Quad summit discussions in March 2021, I am sure that attributions for state-sponsored actors and ransomware attackers, and also the legal prosecution of ransomware attackers will be like the shared concerns between Japan and India as well.
Right. Anit Mukherjee has another question. We've, apart from businesses and institutions, and yeah, we've, I think, been mostly talking about businesses and institutions. How concerned should we be as individuals to cyber attacks, data theft, ransomware? Are we seeing individuals being targeted to lock away their data stored on cloud or email information, for instance?
So ransomware attackers are going after not only the data stored in your servers, but also in the cloud, because especially during this pandemic, organizations tend to shift their data from servers to virtual environment. So wherever your data, precious data is, then the cyber criminals and the state-sponsored actors are going after that direction.
Okay. Kavita Narayan asks, and I think you've already touched upon this, but what kind of capacity building strategies can we share between both countries, India and Japan? How can we start integrating the need for knowledge and competency building on this issue systematically in all critical sectors?
So Japan and India, thanks to Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi's friendship and a strong collaboration between the two countries, and we have already agreed upon the development of transparent and dependable infrastructure in both of the countries. So it means that we already every single country in the world have an interest in protecting the critical infrastructure from cyber attacks and from other types of natural disasters. But because given the partnership on the infrastructure between Japan and India, we have more interest to protect our infrastructure development from cyber attacks and also other types of risks. So I think that critical infrastructure protection is a first step for us to take.
Okay. George Abraham says, very insightful presentation. I'm based in the UK and a leading global location in the cybersecurity space. I'm a member of the UK Cybersecurity Association, and we work at connecting the dots in the ecosystem, for example, between education, industry, and governments. Cyber awareness, boot camps, and certification, making individuals employable is our focus, would be open to connect offline. So what he's telling, anyway, that's it's a comment, it's not a question. I have a question which sort of comes back to investments, and there was another question which was asked along the same lines as well. You mentioned earlier that we are likely to see almost 10% of global GDP being lost to cybercrime damages, and you said if we almost 90 trillion of global GDP, then 9 trillion would be lost. So this is a very large amount, and without any doubt. how do companies become more aware of what they're doing, and how do they, because these are bets, if no one attacks you, then all this investment may not have been made. But if someone attacks you, your life goes for a toss. So how do you calibrate? How do you say that, okay, let's say my company, I'm $100 million company in terms of revenue. How much do I really need to invest in cybersecurity, particularly if I'm a consumer facing company? And is there a number in terms of percentage or effort or people or size of teams and so on?
So various cybersecurity companies and consulting firms have published how much percent of each company's IT budget is spent on cybersecurity. So for instance, in the healthcare sector, 3 to 4%. And in the financial sector, it's 6 to 14%. But I usually do not advise that that number should be applied to your own organizations, because you never know how much money you already spend on IT budget. So you are spending a small amount of IT budget. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to spend much money on cybersecurity. So instead, I usually advise those organizations, so please do risk assessment, not only on cyber risks, but every single type of risk assessment for your entire organization, not only your headquarters, but also your subsidiaries. Then you have a better picture, so in which area you are vulnerable. Maybe stock market, maybe natural disasters, typhoons, or maybe pandemic. And then, because every single sector has and every single organization has a very limited amount of resources to spend on. So now you have a focus areas. So maybe you're very 100% vulnerable to cyber attacks. Then you should spend more money on cybersecurity. But you're already well protected from cyber attacks. Then you don't have to spend more money on cybersecurity, at least for now. So I think that the first step always to take is risk management and risk assessment.
Okay, and you're saying risk management in a broader context, not just cyber. It's about all risk. It could be financial risk and so on, or location risk. Okay, Nalin Kohli asks, from a business opportunity perspective, where do you see opportunities for Japanese and Indian SMEs or small and medium enterprises in the cyberspace?
So there's always problem for smaller companies to protect themselves from cyber attacks, because they don't have specific team, or they don't have enough money to spend on cybersecurity. So that is why most of the cyber attacks are targeting small and medium-sized companies, because they know that they are less protected, but yet they are well connected with bigger players or manufacturers or healthcare sectors. So now what the Japanese government started is several actions to take. So one is that, because you cannot ask smaller companies to do the very complicated cyber defenses. It's impossible. So the government came up with 5 principles for the smaller companies to take. So one is to use a strong password, and B is to use firewall, something like that. And if you do, and you can also get a sort of a certificate if you follow that 5 principles. And B, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry launched a prototype of cybersecurity rescue troop project a couple of years ago, in collaboration with cybersecurity and IT companies and also insurance providers, because cyber insurance is getting a very hot topic in the world. So what the Japanese government and industries have been doing is to provide free cybersecurity consulting services and also detection services for smaller companies in the world, not in the world, in Japan. And see the third action the Tokyo metropolitan government had started a few years ago is because Japan has such a huge manga culture. I'm sure that some of the audiences are big fan of Japanese manga. So what the Japanese metropolitan government did is to publish online manga to really break down what is ransomware attack or what is cybercrime and what kind of actions they can take in a really like a baby step type of breaking down. Because they cannot expect and they can take complicated, expensive cybersecurity measures to take. And from industry side, I've seen several great initiatives. So major Japanese companies, including NTT, have been working with local chambers of commerce to provide cybersecurity workshops for small and medium-sized companies. And also their cybersecurity services specifically for small companies at a reasonable price. And if you go to a restaurant and if you really don't know what to order, you usually go for chef's choice because they already know what to take and what to combine. So there's already a chef's choice in terms of cybersecurity as well in Japan. So it's actually called omakase in Japan too.
Okay, that sounds quite interesting. So, and these are links that are that can be found on the MIT website, MIT IE.
Which one?
The link to this whole how to protect yourself as a small enterprise and so on.
I can send you, but they are in Japanese, I'm afraid.
Okay. Google will translate it.
Okay.
So anyway, you can paste that on the thing later. So let me go on to another question. Sharing information with government departments. Gagandeep Singh asks, sharing information with government departments could be a reactive approach. What is the roadmap of this partnership or in this partnership for a proactive defense? Or can they be one?
So in Japan, there are several types of information sharing frameworks between the Japanese industry and the government, and also sector-specific type of information sharing framework. So for instance, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC, ISAC, is a sector-specific type of information sharing framework to forward cyber threat intelligence and also cybersecurity best practices among members. And ISAC is available not only in Japan, but also in the United States in the various critical infrastructure sectors. And in Japan, different ministries and agencies have launched information sharing framework with different sectors in Japan. So not only the reactive type of information sharing after incident already occurred, the Japanese government and industry have been sharing information in a proactive manner too.
Right, and do you find that if when you share information, do you find that, I mean, in your experience, have governments been quick to respond to private sector needs, whether large or small, or it's more about I'm trying to understand if I'm a company and maybe I share information proactively, and do I expect or can I expect governments to respond fast, or should I be looking out for myself first?
I would say that you have to use multiple channels. So of course, under specific regulations or guidelines, you should report an incident back to the government. But if you want to help your cohorts in your own sector, then you should always also use the sector-specific information sharing framework. Because if the government is taking a step, then it will take 2 stops to go to different organizations. But if you talk to your peers, then it's only 1 stop. So it may be faster.
Right. And I'm assuming, so therefore this means that everyone, particularly the CTO's job is going to get tougher and tougher. And therefore everyone has to be alert, not just to defend your own company, but also to have protocols for sharing information, talking to other people in the same industry. And also, as I'm guessing, looking out to see whether your industry is under attack as an industry, which is particularly given the examples you've shared in the post-pandemic world. So we're coming to the end of our discussion, Mihoko-san. So can I ask you, when you look back in the last couple of years, what's the one or two instances where you've been challenged by a cybersecurity attack and you found it particularly challenging intellectually and maybe as a company, and how have you managed to overcome it? Again, in your, these are, from your own experience. And if so, what are the lessons that people who are here today with us can learn from that?
So once any cyber incident now occurs, it's gonna be a nightmare, because it's not, because first of all, you have to identify this damage, specific damage is coming from a cyber attack, or can be from a system malfunctioning, or it can be from a natural disaster if a typhoon or flooding is hitting your area. So it's not only a problem of a technical team. You also have to work with a crisis management team. You also have to work with communications and marketing team and your leadership. So unless you have already laid out a crisis management and communication system, it will be a really complicated nightmare you had never imagined you would want to have. So,
right.
so always planning ahead, and communications crisis included cyber exercise and crisis management, natural disaster management indispensable. And according to news article on audit on the Colonial Pipeline 3 years ago, they have never had, they didn't have spear phishing email exercise 3 years ago. And they didn't have a chief information security officer at that time. And they didn't have a crisis management plan against ransomware demands. So according to so the data is a bit old because it comes from the 3 years old audit report. But sounds like that if any organizations has a crisis management plan and the leadership who is responsible for such kind of crisis disaster scenarios, then maybe it always a maybe scenario, but then you can might be able to handle and contain that incident in a better manner. So I think that the Colonial Pipeline incident and recent increase in ransomware attacks gave us already very precious lessons to learn to protect ourselves better and to do better for our partnership between Japan and India.
Right. And as you said, your organization or any organization needs to have, a general crisis management plan, but also a crisis management for ransomware plan, given the propensity of attacks and the likelihood of those attacks increasing over time, and particularly as you pointed out in this time during the pandemic, where clearly the kind of access or the nature of access of corporate internet has changed, with many people now sitting outside and not inside, and thus opening up the possibilities. And then of course the increasing cases of state-to-state attacks or espionage, which has its own challenges, which we've not discussed much about, but we can definitely see it happening across around the world now, and therefore the need for greater alertness. Mihoko Matsubara, Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation, Japan. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts candidly, and thank you for also giving many people here a roadmap on how to begin addressing this challenge, whether they are a small enterprise, large enterprise, with government or independently. And hopefully we are able to work with you and your colleagues to build a stronger defense against cyber attacks and ransomware, and look forward to a more safe environment, not just in cybersecurity, but also from the pandemic. On that note, thank you very much. My renewed thanks to the Ananta Aspen Institute for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you and goodbye.